Okay, let's continue on here. Just a comment before I move along here and discuss, let's take a look at what language is according to Chomsky. But keep in mind that in reviewing Bloom and Leahy first, Chomsky's model now, and two other models coming up, we will, what is the importance of these models? What is the importance for assessment? Yes, these models reveal parts of language, the component systems of language and speech that we may choose to evaluate. They tell us what to evaluate. And that's important to know what to evaluate, no? The more you're aware of, the more of these paradigms, points of view about speech and language, based on research which has identified components of speech and language, the more things you have in your mental model to keep in mind as you meet your client and think to yourself, well, what could be contributing to the issue that the individual is raising? A voice issue, a fluency issue, a language issue? What's contributing to it? What are the problems that we may need to address? Or maybe there's no problem. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's not even a problem. Well, Chomsky is a major name in the field, and I've been extremely influenced by that man. And he takes a point of view about language that, as I see it, very, overlaps with the Bloom and Leahy position, but it's a little bit different. Because remember, Bloom and Leahy said language is a code. That's what they wrote. It's a code that represents ideas about the world. Well, a code is what's coming out of my mouth, the symbol system that's expressed to others. But Chomsky takes a slightly different perspective, although it certainly overlaps with Bloom's and Leahy's conception of the code itself. Because according to Chomsky, language is a biologic relationship-making property of the mind. It's a property of the mind. It's a tool of thought, this property of mind, that is language. It's a property of mind, much like cognition, but it's a tool of thought. This property of mind functions both to express and comprehend. In other words, there's no receptive language and no expressive language, according to Chomsky. They're not two separate behavioral systems, two types of behaviors, two kinds of language. There's only one language, and its job is to express and comprehend. And it's what the mind does. And this mind property has universal characteristics. Universal means that language is the same. There are aspects of language, since it's a function of what the mind does. It's what the mind does. And all human beings, whether they're from the United States, Canada, Sweden, Ghana, Colombia, South America, Guatemala, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what the language is that the individual speaks. Does not matter. Language in capital L is what the mind is doing to create or comprehend the spoken or the language that's being listened to. Language, I always say sometimes, these days I'm saying language with a capital L is what the mind does. Language with a small l, what's produced and heard. Well, all languages have universal characteristics, according to Chomsky. Have, in other words, the same characteristic. So that's weird. Maybe weird, but even though the languages may sound very different to each of us, maybe I certainly barely process English. I'm not bilingual, I'm monolingual, and I'm sorry about that, but that's the best I did over my lifetime. One language. But even though I cannot comprehend Swedish or a little Spanish, a little French maybe, but I'm not great at it. Even if I can't understand it if somebody came in and you and I actually as clinicians need to study speech and language, don't we? And really come to an understanding of the language spoken by our client, we'll find that there's similarities, even if we're having trouble comprehending. And that's because these universal characteristics are about the mind function that is language, and they create structures that express relational meaning. And we understand what relational meaning is when we think about it, because that's what Bloom and Leahy was all about. The relationships that allow for the content categories, such as existence, action relationships, action, location relationships, locative action, locative state, causal relations, causal complex sentences, epistemic relationships, sentences that talk about what I know that, I pretended that, I thought that, etc., right? And that's expressive language, creating the relational meaning and interpreting the relational meaning. Well, that's comprehension, isn't it? And language both using its relationship making properties, express ideas, these relational meanings, structures, relational meaning, and comprehend. And language acts exclusively on mental representations, not real-world objects, according to Chomsky. Now that's very important in our line of work, speech-language pathology, and the specific line of work or component of our profession that we're looking at in this course, assessment. Because there's nothing that's about language that's not a mental representation. You don't believe me, I don't believe. But everything about language is a mental representation. Well, I'm sure you believe me when we talk about syntax or actual words you recognize, or phonemes even, the sounds that make up the words. Perhaps you're aware that syntax is sentence rules for sentence making that exist in the mind. Phonology are the rules or the parameters of sound that allow us to distinguish puzz from buzz and tuzz from does. Well, that's a kind of a representation in the mind. Morphemes, words and their components, cat, cat in English, gato in Spanish, perro, dog, dog in English. Those things are words, they're representations of the real things out there. But there's no real thing even. I'm gonna add to that language content. Isn't that the real word? Isn't that real? Isn't that the real thing? Isn't that this computer? If I say the word computer, I'm referring to this real thing out here? No. Well, maybe yes and no. But unless I am aware and thinking about this thing and recognizing it as a computer, I will not name it. Will I? I will not refer to this thing as a computer unless I've represented this pile of metal and these buttons and stuff like that. If I've represented this thing as a computer, if I'm working with a child or an adult who's not thinking of this as a computer, well, then they'll say something else because it's how they're thinking about it. That's what they're going to express as content, right? Content of mind. And mind. That means represented in mind. So content, form, and use, all of it are really representations, and that's what language is about. And all the subcomponents, by the way, phonology, morphology, syntax, etc. It's a group of linguistic objects, and thus in assessment, we're trying to understand how the client has represented these different things, and when we do treatment, which is one of the things, if you remember, I think we spoke already about the reasons for assessing, one of which is to plan intervention. You're really planning to help the client represent things that they may have difficulty representing one way or another. That's what Chomsky teaches us. It's that mind function that operates on these representations. And some examples of representational or relational measures, by the way, which Chomsky, both Bloom and Leahy and Chomsky alert us to, are the Piagetian, this is not in the area of language, but in the area of cognition, the Piagetian model identifying sensory motor, pre-operational and operational thinking. That's a relational measure. Bloom and Leahy's content form taxonomy, which talks about reflexive object relations like existence, recurrence, disappearance, action relations, locative action, complex sentence type event relations, such as additive, temporal, causal, epistemic communication. This should sound familiar to you. These verb relation and non-verb relation content categories, object relation content categories, event relation content form interactions. These are relational measures. They identify, they focus on, they allow us to assess one or another relationship-making property of the mind. And pretend place assessments, such as Westby's and Nikolich's, they're relational type they evaluate relational things, such as single scheme pretend play, combinatorial scheme pretend play, script play. These are the relationships kids are making among objects. They're representations of objects as toys, as pretend things, as they create, play scenarios. And you see that it's relationship making because kids are physically putting things together and taking things apart and stacking things and feeding, putting the doll and the bottle together, putting the comb and the hair together, etc., right? That is the idea that languages and its very closely related components, external systems such as language, cognition, are relationship-making properties of the mind. That's what Chomsky reveals to us, and this relationship-making is something we need to assess and potentially address in intervention planning. Let's pause here again for a second, and then we're going to move along to language as information processing.